With the recent assassination attempt on President Trump, many people have been shocked and stunned at just how close our country came to real historic tragedy and chaos. Now, regardless of how you might identify politically, when political violence like this recent attempt is successful, it usually results in societal chaos, danger, death, and collapse of many norms in human relations. It isn't good. Now, thank God it wasn't successful this time. However, let's just look at how political efforts to hype and then spin up crazy people will almost always result in this type of horrible, violent outcome, and then some lessons I think we can learn. So listen, I often get anonymous crazies in the comments section basically claiming that voting and activism doesn't matter. And they often attack me for encouraging people like you to stop being apathetic and assuming that somebody else is going to come and rescue you. Now, many times these conveniently anonymous commenters, they often imply that violent conflict in some type of civil war confrontation is inevitable, and they even seem eager for that type of outcome. Now, it's easy to be a brave keyboard warrior in anonymity, but for the most part, reasonable people who have some sense of history and human nature, they're usually more mature, and they will not see them calling for some type of political violence, at least certainly not as a solution. Now, 10 years ago, I actually once wrote a draft article, which I ended up just never publishing, and I was working for the Freedom Foundation at the time, but it explored the question of when political resistance to political abuse of our constitutional freedoms and liberties could actually shift into the horror of legitimizing defensive violence. And it was a wonkish and intellectual discussion of the largely kind of taboo subject back then. And I remember I chose not to publish it at the time because I just didn't want somebody to blow it out of context and basically the intention in which it was written. And then, of course, they would always try to claim that I was somehow justifying violence, despite the extensive body of work that I already had at that time in encouraging just the exact opposite. Now, the current very obvious problem that we have in our political culture is the effort of basically some to just hype up the less stable people with just crazy attacks like these from just all over the traditional kind of left-leaning and approved media. I mean, heck, it's actually so common for our traditional media to compare Trump to Hitler that there are thousands of examples of them doing just exactly this. And unlike conservative commenters who just want to push back against this type of rhetoric, nobody on the left gets censored. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want them to be censored either, but I do want you to see just how unhinged our media actors and the leftists and then others really are. I mean, let them foam at the mouth and we can see how crazy they really are. They eventually will let their mask slip, and I don't want to censor that. But of course, when we try to point it out, only those of us who actually dare to speak truth to power, we're the ones that get censored or shadow banned or silenced today. Now, that imbalance, I believe, both encourages more crazy, just kind of rage rhetoric like this, and it unfortunately just tends to feed on itself. And this also creates a sense that really nobody disagrees with their craziness because the alternative voices are often silenced, censored, or shadow banned. Now, this is really one of the problems that we have in our modern censored world today. Google, Facebook, YouTube, and other major tech companies, they basically bend over backwards to censor, shadow ban, disappear, or silence those who are not making government-approved commentary or politically unapproved statements. Now, because of that, there is just increasingly very limited debate on competitive ideas, and this indeed does produce silos of speech, which allows the traditional media, their jet-setting kind of Hollywood allies, and then the political left to ratchet up the rage rhetoric. And then we have these guys endlessly claiming that Trump is marching in arm with the Third Reich, which will eventually spin up crazies and unstable people to take the next logical step, which is, of course, violence, just like we saw over the weekend. Now, these types of unstable people will fall for this hype and propaganda, or it will help them basically push them over the top. And then, of course, they will then take their very best shot, whatever it is, at stopping Hitler. Now, it isn't just Trump for whom they whip up their calls for violence, although he kind of seems to be their main target right now. Unfortunately, their endless panic rage rhetoric kind of spins up crazies, like the Bernie Sanders supporter who basically attempted to assassinate Republican legislators at their baseball practice just a few years ago in June of 2017, almost killing Republican Congressman Scalise at the same time. Now, in that assassination attempt, the attacker even shouted about health care. Well, he pulled the trigger. Now, he committed this crime after listening to the exaggerated panic rage from the Republican-hating media claiming that the Republicans were going to destroy health care in America. So he had to come save it. Now, it isn't just the politicians who get targeted with this rage. The leftist media's kind of mouth-foaming mental breakdowns and their screeds really helped convince a crazy guy here in 2022 to drive all the way from California across the country in an apparent effort to kill Justice Kavanaugh and then kidnap him at home. Now, you and I also saw this exact same type of hyped rage in a more widespread level during the 2020 BLM leftist riots, with their mostly peaceful murders and arson and widespread destruction all around the nation. Of course, it was mostly peaceful. The direct attacks on police escalated at that time, and our current kind of vice president, Kamala Harris, she herself was actually involved in raising money to bail out these violent rioters and get them back on the street for presumably more peaceful murder, arson, and mayhem. Now, the media at the time justified the violence and censored any critique of the attacks on police, and the media bent over backwards to cover up the violent rioters and excuse their behavior, which, of course, just encourages more of it. Now, at a more local level here in the Pacific Northwest in 2020, we actually saw a leftist Antifa type ambush and then murder Aaron Danielson in downtown Portland. The security camera video of this horrific event clearly showed that the self-proclaimed leftist Antifa attacker, he was ambushing and ultimately murdered Aaron. Now, this Antifa leftist even bragged about this in a video interview where he claimed it was self-defense to murder Danielson. Now, like most of his Antifa friends, the attacker was spun up by the insane kind of anti-police rhetoric at the time, the Antifa leftist religion that they just kind of promote in Portland, and then justified his violence and his participation in a murder as a political necessary kind of step. Now, inevitably, these people who commit the violence are troubled individuals who are wound up by others, and the perpetrators of violence use the hype and the rage rhetoric to create a narrative in their own mind which simply justifies their violence and the murders that they commit or attempt to commit. This is not unique or new today. This has actually been true for quite some time, for a long time. It's not new at all. Most famously, for example, 110 years ago, a Serb nationalist successfully assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And just like people who commit violence today, he was inspired and motivated by extreme rhetoric and political rage in his time. Unfortunately, in this example, from so long ago, back in 1914, it became the widely recognized domino of violence, kind of a spark that set the forest fire that led, unfortunately, very quickly to the horrific consequences of World War I and the death of millions of people in that horrific conflict at the time. Now, 13 years even before that, an anarchist here in America was able to successfully assassinate Republican President McKinley in 1901. It was at a public fair up in Buffalo, New York. And the assassin openly did so as part of the anarchist political desire to destroy social and economic hierarchies in America. This is a belief not much different, frankly, than what is expressed by most modern leftists who basically run college campuses, or they, unfortunately, are even running government today. Anyone who has studied history is well aware that political violence and spinning up kind of crazy and disturbed people to commit political violence, it will end with consequences that we can't even imagine. And those consequences are just not going to be any good. Now, nobody can, with any certainty, predict the consequences of a successful assassination of Donald Trump. But we came terrifyingly close, literally just inches away, from discovering what those horrible consequences would be if that sniper's plan had actually been successful. Now, in the end, he still murdered an innocent bystander and seriously injured several others, in addition to wounding Trump. And this was terrifying enough by itself. But sadly, I don't really see the people who spend their day basically daydreaming about Trump's demise or the demise of the rest of us, those of us who don't kind of buy the proper political elite propaganda, for example. I don't actually see these people who hype up the exaggerated rage rhetoric against Trump backing off. I mean, they seem determined to continue trying to spin up the crazies. And they won't stop, and why not? They'll pretend they had nothing to do with the crazy guy that they spun up and inspired on his violent mission. And the traditional media, as always, is going to cover for them, and they know it. Now, to some extent, we do see some dawning recognition in the minds of a few people in the media that they're partly to blame for the out-of-control rhetoric, and maybe they'll back off their Hitler obsessions. But no, that's probably wishful thinking on my part. I'm sure this is only a minor reprieve as they jump right back into full attack Trump and Trump is Hitler mode. Or better yet, they'll start to use this as an excuse to take away even more of our freedoms. I mean, they're already claiming that they need more censorship, not of the lefties, of course, but instead the rest of us who dare question them and their violent rhetoric. And of course, they want to disarm us so that the super competent government that we see all the time can protect us from ourselves. Well, they promote early release of violent felons into our community with zero consequences for their criminality. Yeah, this is typical and predictable. But there are some lessons to be learned from this whole scary episode, and perhaps we can actually learn basically some of these lessons moving forward. Now, first of all, there are consequences to censorship and silencing all dissent, which has been such a priority for our political and media elite today. There is nothing government and their big tech fellow travelers love more than silencing anyone who dares to question their narrative or anything else they do. Now, speaking truth to power is no longer acceptable and will always be labeled misinformation or dangerous. Now, they don't mind comparing everyone they dislike to Hitler. That, of course, is okay. But if you dare to question them, then only you must be censored, people like you and I. Now, this is inevitably builds up these weird silo effects of communication only with those with whom you already agree, and it tends to spiral into very bad outcomes. Censorship is not good. And it was a horrible mistake, I think, for the U.S. Supreme Court recently to kind of take a pass on this issue in the Murphy versus Missouri case. And this is because just the cowardice of confronting this issue only encourages the ongoing political elitist effort to practice widespread coordinated censorship on behalf of kind of a ruling elite. As the Twitter files clearly exposed, along with countless other examples, the government's outsourcing of their censorship plan does not result in better free speech or the truth. And instead, this sets the foundation for deceptive fake narratives and no ability for anybody to question authority along the way. You don't stop misinformation with censorship. You can stop it with more free speech. But instead, unfortunately, we're still living in a world today where censorship is used to facilitate and promote misinformation, like the Trump is Hitler narrative, which can just be used to justify all types of bad outcomes. Now, I believe one partial solution would be to roll back these censorship efforts by our government and their delegated patsies in big tech. I think that'd be important. Now, secondly, the government's default setting is always bumbling incompetence at best, and corruption at its worst. My description of government bureaucracy has always been that it's a mountain of corruption concealed by an ocean of incompetence. Now, the hardest part in trying to fix what is broken in government is actually to distinguish between the corruption and the incompetence. We can reduce both, though, with more transparency and free speech, in my opinion. But nobody should be surprised when we see the Secret Service screw up in such a major way by leaving that obvious nearby rooftop wide open for a crazed assassin to take his best shot. Anyone paying attention to this specific agency has been aware of weird problems now for years, going all the way back to the Obama administration when they had various fence-jumping events at the White House. And even more recently, a mental breakdown of a Secret Service agent on Kamala Harris's detail, and other indications of agency dysfunction and quality control failures. I mean, never be surprised by the incompetence, but it is good to discuss and analyze these things in an effort, as public and transparent as we possibly can get it, as much as it may seem like a forlorn hope at times, and this will help, I think, reduce the incompetence moving forward. Government is never going to be the solution to our problems, and I hope everyone realizes this. Government bureaucracy will almost always make things worse. They can't get the simple things right, so why do we expect them to solve complex problems? Shrinking the size, scope, and cost of the administrative state, that should be a priority for all of us. If for no other reason than just to limit the focus for government, basically on key tasks and priorities rather than this blizzard of waste that we just find government involved in today. Now, finally, I believe that we can all recognize that we live in serious times with incredible and sometimes very dangerous inflection points all around us, hinging on things as simple as whether a politician happened to turn his head just a bit at the right time. And it's scary to even contemplate predictable scenarios if our political process degrades into that type of horrific violence, which we witnessed this last weekend. However, you are not as helpless as you might feel most of the time. The challenge that we all must face is whether we're willing to actually make a difference or try to hide and hope it passes us by. Will you let apathy and fear rule your future, or will you take educated and rational chances to put in the energy and work to help fix what is broken in government? It isn't easy, and nobody should pretend that it is. It is more than just voting or buying a red hat to wear around. And this doesn't mean that everybody listening to this video needs to go run for office either. I mean, some do, but not everyone. We are often flooded, I find, with people running for higher office, Congress or something, with no plan, no preparation, and no chance, and it kind of just wastes our time. However, you can find teams of people near you who care about your local community, your local school board, maybe your local city council or county commission, fire district, and other local offices where I think first-time candidates, for example, they often can win elections in those locations. And then a very few dedicated activists can actually make a very big impact on the direction that local communities are headed. You can become a subject matter expert on your local government, and you can be quite effective at finding that perfect candidate who should run. You can review the actions, budgets, and choices made by your current politicians and the bureaucrats to see what is being done, or whether it's right or wrong where you live. Now, unfortunately, you're going to probably discover that there are a lot of problems, even locally. But that's okay, because you can't fix what is broken until you actually understand what they're doing wrong in the first place. Now, this is the type of engagement that actually does change the future, and usually in a good way. This is how we should engage and do what we can for long-term, impactful change. It isn't glamorous, it rarely makes headlines, you won't become famous, and it probably won't win you many accolades. But it does start the process of effective change where you live, and you can start to fix what is broken. But we can only do these things and make these changes and improve the future if we're willing to show up. We can't do them if we pre-surrender, hide away, hoping nobody notices us, or timidly mumble about it behind closed doors. We must show up and engage, because in the end, the future belongs only to those who show up.